Welcome to IMF World Bank Week at the Atlantic Council and Decoding the World Economic Outlook. I'm Josh Lipsky, Chair of International Economics and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center. This is one of our favorite events during IMF World Bank Week, and this is the 11th edition, believe it or not, team, of Decoding the World Economic Outlook. Many people say a fan favorite here at IMF World Bank Week at the Atlantic Council. I am honored to be joined by our senior fellows, an all-star cast, Elizabeth Shortino, Martin Mühleisen, Hung Tran, Nicole Goldin. Thank you all for being here, and not just for helping me decode the World Economic Outlook, but also for all the work you are doing throughout the week. For those who haven't seen the live blog we're running at the Atlantic Council, check it out. Immediate reactions to Secretary Besson Speech, to everything that's happening inside the IMF and World Bank. Some of the best analysis in the business, a little biased about it, but I think everyone should see it. So we're going to dive right into the numbers, and I'm going to pull up the charts if we can get this up on the screen. So these are the IMF's growth projections here. You look at 2025 global growth downgraded to 2.8%, I think a 0.5 downgrade from the January WEO, back up to 3 in 2026. Look at the advanced economies, down to 1.4 in 2025. The US, obviously one of the most significant downgrades, and EMDs 3.7 in 2025. And if we dig a little bit into the individual countries, the US at 1.8, just think of where we were in January and where we are today. It's shocking. Euro area at 0.8. Across the euro area, you see the various, but downgrades almost across the board. China down to 4%. We can talk about that, whether we feel like that's right. And we can talk about overall some of the feedback that's already been given to the World Economic Outlook. Is it too rosy? And I just want to start out, and I'm going to go down the line. Let's stipulate this was an extraordinarily complicated WEO to do. It's always complicated to do the WEO, but in this environment, given what's happened over the past month with Liberation Day and the backtracking, I think we all have a lot of respect for our colleagues working on this. That being said, let's nitpick it. So, Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you, your reactions.
Sure, and thank you, Josh. It's really exciting to be here on this side of the table, commenting on the WEO in a brief 45-minute session instead of sitting in the executive board, commenting on the WEO for 3 to 4 hours and on top of a lengthy statement that I would issue in advance. But absolutely, I mean, I feel for the WEO team, and I just want to commend Petya Coevert-Brooks and all of her team and the folks at the WEO and the GFSR and FAD, and because this was not an easy one to write. For context, oftentimes these are discussed by the board in late March. Obviously, a lot happened since then, so I'm sure there were some very late nights. I felt like the WEO overall did a very good job in terms of how to structure all of the uncertainty. The approach of a reference forecast, I'm honestly not quite sure what a reference forecast means.
We've pulled it up here so folks can try to understand. And your explanation of what a reference forecast is.
I think a reference forecast is just a different name for a baseline forecast, but we don't want to use the word baseline because it sounds too certain, and I think that's right. And then having these scenarios of pre-April 2nd and post-April 9th, I think this was a nice way for the fund to capture different changes to the outlook with all of these adjustments. I think there are two ways to approach this. Was this too rosy? Potentially, yes, and I'll get into some reasons why maybe a little bit later. But also, I appreciate that the WEO didn't feed into alarmist rhetoric that is already kind of out there in the press. It did try to take a balanced tone, and I think there's some benefit to that because I think the IMF needed to kind of provide that alternate data-based view to kind of counter some of the bigger, maybe more alarming news that we've seen. I think there's some value there, but we can get into whether it was actually too rosy as we discuss some of the underlying assumptions.
So let's go through that. And Martin, I want to turn to you, your reactions overall to the WEO, and also on this chart, this global economic downturn threshold. We've heard global economic recession threshold before. Global economic downturn threshold is interesting. So your take on the reference forecast and overall on the WEO.
So I want to join Elizabeth in the compliments to the team this year round, or this round. It's been difficult, but they did a nice job in really presenting the different scenarios that almost like week by week followed various tariff announcements, right? So let's not focus too much on the numbers themselves, because you could characterize the current situation that we're living not so much in times of risk, but in times of Knightian uncertainty, by which economists mean a term named after Frank Knight, Chicago professor, I believe, a long time ago, where we don't know what we don't know. And we can't really assess the degree of risk. Normally, if there's risk, we can do some probabilities around it, but we don't have that right now, because it's all driven by very discrete decisions coming mostly out of the White House and out of Beijing, of course, to a large extent. But they try to do a good job in at least presenting the dimension. And I find it interesting, for example, how the scenario after the April 2 announcements, when some of the tariffs were paused for 90 days, but the tariffs on China were increased, how that kind of doesn't really change the overall growth outlook, but it very much changes the distribution of the losses, increasing for the US and China under that scenario. So that gives you at least a feel for what's going on right now. As always with the WEO, which is a constant feature, I think, or the GFSR, much of the value added really is in the risk discussion. And that's been also very good, I think, both across the WEO and the GFSR. And we can go a bit more into detail there. But it's been a very difficult job, and I think this time they really provided a service to the global community, because fund economists, the IMF, they really have a unique point of view that is very necessary in times of uncertainty, and I think they really delivered this time.
It's such a good point, because Chair Powell said just last week, it's very hard to model a situation where we haven't had tariffs this high in a century. And I look at what the IMF did as saying, we're trying. We're trying our best, recognizing all the uncertainties. Hung, over to you. The GFSR was invoked, and you're always our voice of the GFSR on this panel. So your thoughts on that, and also WEO Chapter 1.
If I might start with the WEO first, and seeing I share my colleagues' statement, I just want to look at it from a different point of view, what the WEO have missed and not pay enough attention, instead of what the numbers we see. Number one is that when people forecast, and not here just the IMF, but anybody else, they tend to look at the latest few months, see how the economy is doing, and from today's point of view, look forward and try to adjust it a bit up and down and come up with kind of estimation. This time around, we see huge distortion because of the front loading of many countries in front of the tariffs. They try to spend more, export more. For consuming country, they try to buy more, import more, and that caused significant distortion in the pattern of growth and export growth and import demand. I think that the numbers in the next few months will really show the extent of the tariffs' impact on economic activity. So personally, I think that when we come around for the annual meetings in October, the WEO then probably will have more adjustment and more changes than normally is the case. A second point is that, understandably, the analysis focus on tariffs and the impact of tariffs. However, for the US, tariff is only one part of the story. The other part of the story is domestic tax policy. Just to give you the example, the administration estimates that tariffs will raise $2 trillion over the next 10 years. So great money for the US. However, on the tax cuts that are in the budget going through Congress reconciliation now, over the next 10 years, we will lose 4 to 5 trillion shortfall. So at the end, we are likely to increase our budget deficit by several trillions going forward at an already very high level of debt and deficit. I think that will have a more significant impact on US growth, outlook for the dollar, and go on, not just tariffs.
Thank you, Hung. Nicole, I want to turn to you because, one, you've been on the other side of 19th Street sometime today. So the bank's view of the global economic outlook, and about the WEO specifically, but also how the bank is seeing the situation right now.
Sure, and thanks. It's great to be back. Great to have Elizabeth with us this time. And I don't know the team that prepares this like our colleagues here do, but I do echo the sort of gratitude and compliments to the team for what they were able to put together. And so, coming from more of the other side of 19th Street and a focus on, the emerging market and the developing economies, picking up on what Hung was saying about tariff not being the only part of the story, it's, of course, a big part of the story in the developing world and the developing economies. Tariffs often have a disproportionate impact, or at least an equal impact on those economies. And so I think, accounting for that was obviously something that needed to be done. But what we're also seeing, and the WEO does acknowledge it, is over this past quarter, if you will, we have started to see, a rapid decline and diminution of official development assistance, which in many of these countries has a significant impact on their budgets, right? And that's quite immediate. But that is, again, on top of what was already a limited fiscal space. Many of these countries, as the WEO pointed out and accounts for, are in or at high risk of debt distress. As I said, now compounding that with declining ODA, with the impacts of the tariffs and the trade wars and their ability to invest in growth. So that's the concern. I think that's kind of where they got it right, and why we see the decline, the downgrade in the EMDEs as much as we're seeing in many of the other countries. Interestingly, the one region that actually does not have a downgrade is Middle East and Central Asia. They actually have a slight uptick among the EMDEs. But there's concerns, there's growth. I think there's not growth, and it relates to, again, many of the issues that from a development perspective, we're seeing reference, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well.
And this has been a lot of the conversation in the hallways over the past couple days, how these countries, the EMDs, are going to need support, both from the fund and the bank going forward, because of the tariffs, not only because of the tariffs, but as the primary driver of what was different for them than a few months ago, it's the tariffs. And that's a conversation no one expected to have when they last met.
Absolutely.
So Elizabeth, I want to go back to the US and just dive in a little bit. You've made this point on the blog about the fiscal situation. Hung referenced this as well, but this was as important a part of WEO Chapter 1 as the baseline forecast or the reference forecast,
yes.
Whatever we're calling it.
No, absolutely. I mean, with any of these forecasts, you really have to look at the underlying assumptions, and the forecast is only as good as the assumptions hold, right? And those are tricky. So there are some things in here in the reference forecast, around inflation going up that seem reasonable, but then you have to scroll down to box 1.1 well into the document to see the risk assessment around the reference. And if you really dig into that, you start to realize that some of what the IMF is characterizing as a risk assessment is actually very likely to hold true. So things like the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I mean, already we're seeing signs that that's going to happen, right? And there might not be offsets for it. You also look at things around China, weaker domestic demand in China. And weaker productivity in Europe. So some of these things are framed as risks, and they are risks, but they're not. They are reasonable risks that might even already be materializing. So that's something to consider, and that gets back to this. Maybe this is even too optimistic. I mean, more generally, I think the WEO struggled with covering the U.S. fiscal position. And in the current environment, the fiscal position is really key, not just for the U.S. growth outlook, given all of the tariffs that we're looking at, but also for this broader question of external rebalancing, and is the administration going to achieve what they want in terms of the tariffs and shifting the balance of growth amongst the world. This is a really tricky issue to cover, so I kind of understand why the team couldn't go in depth in time for this WEO, but I certainly hope it's covered in the next WEO, because it really is key to what we're looking at in terms of forecasts.
I think that's such a great point, and it also puts renewed interest in the July WEO update, which we don't often pay as much attention to as the WEOs themselves, but this July WEO update, given what is going to transpire, Liberation Day extension ends July 8th, although the White House often says it's actually July 4th. It depends how you count 90 days, but that's July WEO is going to be particularly interesting. And I'm really glad you referenced the box. Our colleague Christoph Rosenberg from the IMF is here. I remember we used to talk about exploding boxes, where you put the most interesting things tucked away in a box at a WEO, and I think you've identified a good one. Martin, your reaction on the rosy versus not rosy, the overly optimistic claim that's been made about this WEO, with all caveats necessary?
No, well, as I said before, the most interesting part to read is always the risk discussion, because the numbers are like, okay, I know about these risks, or maybe they already happened, but I don't want to be kind of get in trouble with my authorities that I work with. So, let's just say it's a risk, and maybe the numbers are a little bit more on the optimistic side. But, that's just human, and it's been a consistent pattern over many, I would say, decades almost. So that's why I think Elizabeth's point on that some of the things that we already anticipate are in the risk discussion, but really, for example, by the way, the US fiscal, the fiscal monitor came out today, and the fiscal monitor is projecting 5.5% to 6% deficit over the medium term, plus or minus. It could be worse, but it's not that the US desk is taking an overly rosy position on the fiscal outlook. If you think it compares to the 3% objective that Secretary Besson has put forward, it's quite a stark contrast. Maybe one interesting point, or I should say on the US, this uncertainty that I mentioned earlier. Apparently, the White House was impressed by a visit of some of the CEOs of the large retail companies that said, look, if you're going to go through with these plans, we're going to have empty shelves in a couple of weeks. Just imagine about sentiments, about inflation expectations, about just general animal spirits when you get into a situation after, a natural catastrophe or an epidemic, and it's self-inflicted also. That would really kind of depress the outlook, and the shock to the system and the kind of impact on small businesses and the like would really be huge. So we're really talking about big risks here, and we'll have to just see how this plays out. But coming back to the macro, what I wanted to say is that one interesting argument that is also picked up in the risk discussion is monetary policy and how it can react to these shocks, because the tariffs will be to some extent inflationary, even if offset maybe by a weaker economy, and the balance will see how it plays out. But there will be an issue with inflation expectations that will make it harder for central banks to calibrate policy. The aftermath of the COVID epidemic, the inflation experience back then, when it went 8-9% for a little while, will be on people's minds, and the expectations could well be that, maybe we're going to be back in that territory given the magnitude of tariffs. So, I will do something in anticipation of this, and the kind of the run on iPhones and other equipment is kind of a sign of that people are now more alert to these inflation developments, and that will make it harder. For the central banks to either lower rates if the economy really tanks, or they may have to raise more in case inflation really goes up. So that's another risk that I found remarkable. And then in terms of emerging markets, there's as you also mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, in the talk between the two of us, there is a funny kind of discussion about risks from a dollar shock to emerging markets if the dollar appreciates. May well happen at some point, but right now we're seeing, of course, the opposite. But still, if the Trump administration is serious in wanting exporting countries to lower their surpluses vis-à-vis the US, which will be made much more difficult by higher deficit, emerging markets that are really export dependent will get hit one way or another, either by kind of tariffs and demand, or by eventually some exchange rate movements, higher interest rates. So that requires the IMF to be alert and maybe to use some of their 1 trillion balance sheet at some point. that's also kind of out there in the future.
The balance sheet was already referenced several times today by Secretary Besson in his speech, which we could talk about, not quite on decoding the WEO, but I think relevant to the day. But Hung, I want to talk about China for a moment. We have talked about the US forecast, but we haven't talked about the China forecast. And of course, the overly rosy criticism extends to the forecast on China as well, whether the downgrade to 4% really prices in everything that China's likely to experience in the year and years ahead.
Right. I will apply the same process that Elizabeth start out looking at the assumption and looking at how the argument and the analysis to come up with the estimate and forecast for China and for the euro area. If I may, I start with the euro area. I think that the analysis in my reading is not sufficiently devoted to the fact that the euro area going forward will enjoy a lot of tailwind. The ECB has been able to cut earlier, more, and will go longer than the Fed, because inflation is not a problem there. In fact, the whole tariff thing is deflationary for Europe, inflationary for the US, not the other way around. So monetary policy, tailwind. Fiscal policy, big tailwind. The huge increase in spending for infrastructure and defense, not only in Germany, but across the EU, particularly with the European defense mechanism probably allowed to issue joint debt to fund defense spending all across Europe. So between those two things, I think that the growth forecast for Europe, 0.8%, probably will end up being revised upward a few months from now, number one. China, again, it's difficult to say. You have a school of thought saying that all the numbers from China are being manufactured anyway, so we don't really know where they stand. Now, if you take that view, then you cannot really say anything about China. But since we believe in the IMF numbers, let's look at the numbers that the WEO puts up. I think that if you look at China, there are several things that are not fully accounted in the analysis. Number one, China can and has already shown that it wants to gradually devalue the renminbi. In the last few weeks, they come in and fix the currency all the way at the lower end of the daily range, and they guided weaker. So year to date, renminbi is weaker by 3-4%. That is one thing that can help them a little bit to endure the tariffs. Number two, there is sign in the last few months of stabilization in the property markets. We all know that in the past few years, that is the biggest headwind against growth in China. And now, if they just stabilize it, let alone recovering, that removes the headwind. And number three, the central government has shown that it is willing, able to issue more central government bonds to replace the debt of the local government authorities, which many have attributed as one of the constraint on growth because they are not able to spend and invest like they used to do. Now, if they can use government debt to allow central, local and municipal government to spend more and invest more, that is another small tailwind. So altogether, it's not clear if China is going to miss its 5% target. Optically, the government wants to see 5%, and I give some weight to that wish to come true.
I haven't seen any reaction yet from Chinese officials on the downgrade. Maybe there's been, but I haven't seen. But I'm curious what they say. And on the euro area, I'm glad you said that because we had the governor of the Banque de France here not 90 minutes ago making these points about the upside. Oh my God, I'm speaking like the IMF, upside risk. I was going to say upside risk, which everyone who knows me knows I hate that term. So now it's fully upside risk. It's not good English, but it's good macroeconomics. Yeah. Nicole, we talked about WEO Chapter 1, but there's more to it. I wanted to talk about WEO Chapter 2, the silver economy, which I think would have gotten more attention if we weren't in the midst of a trade war.
Absolutely. And actually, if I may, can I do a quick pickup on Hung for a minute? Because it's actually a sort of almost the opposite side of the silver economy, which I'll get to. But we've talked in China, and I'm just curious your thoughts about the youth unemployment challenge in China has been a kind of lingering challenge. And, it seems that with everything else, that it was a little bit sort of ignored in the China story. So I'm just curious if they don't seem to have fixed it from my view. So I'm just curious if you think that that's still playing in, and then we can talk about the other side of demographic going globally?
Well, the story about young employment or unemployment in China has a lot to do with the high tech, big tech companies in the several years before being put under constraint by Xi Jinping. And since they are pulling back, they have not been able, the Alibaba, the Tencent of this world, to create the kind of jobs that young people in China want to have. But now Xi Jinping has changed. He had a very well advertised meeting with the head of all of these high-tech companies, and they said now China is open for your business again. And there are indications that those companies indeed have expanded, invest more, and create more jobs. So I think that if they continue to do that, then at least some of the high-paying, well-meaning jobs that the young people, well-educated people in China want to have, now they can have some. Okay. Not 100%, but some. So that problem probably is being alleviated to some extent.
Good to hear. Well, on the other side of the demographic coin, and to sort of going back to your earlier question about what the other side of 19th Street is reading, I feel like the analytical chapters are often where the kind of medium to long-term growth issues, are looked at, and that's, as a development economist, where I often find interest. This one in particular, as we've talked about, is of interest because there is great opportunity. I mean, I've we've talked about the demographic opportunities, and often it's the youth demographic dividend, what many will call the first demographic dividend, that comes from tapping into a large young population with education investment and harnessing that productivity perspective. But as many of the middle income and starting into some of the advanced economies are aging, there's an interest in the silver economy. And what's interesting is that, and as the chapter 2 looks at, with this sort of health innovations that we're seeing and healthier aging, people are interested and able to kind of work longer, stay in the workforce into later years, work longer hours. And there was an interesting, I thought the most interesting sort of encouraging data points from the chapter was that they looked at 40 plus middle income and sort of upper middle income, some advanced economies, and ran some models and found that a 70-year-old in 2022, let me make sure I get this right. Yeah, 70-year-old in 2022 was, with the sort of health and cognitive progress, was as productive as a 53-year-old, which really caught my attention, in the year 2000. And that over 10 years, it's quite the thing. And that over 10 years, this cognitive ability, or this cognitive benefit, you might call it, advance, could lead to 30% more earnings, which is really significant. And that can contribute, and that sort of healthy aging globally, they said, could account for, up to almost 0.5% contribution to GDP annually over 20 years, 2025 to 2050. So that's sort of a both a near, medium, and longer term gain that is really significant. So it's not just in the kind of GDP productivity and from the employment participation, but it's also from the kind of the consumption patterns. And again, as people are able to potentially sort of save more and increase their wealth over the years, and they have that spending, and they're spending it differently. Again, and they're spending it longer because they're living longer. So that money is sort of coming into before it potentially transfers into the generations. So it's a really interesting story, and it is starting to affect more and more economies because more are starting to get through that demographic transition worldwide. Fertility rates are starting to fall. So it's a really interesting conversation, and this whole second demographic dividend, and how do you tap into that opportunity, and where where AI, where digital comes in, is really interesting.
That's a great data point.
Can I say
Thanks
some
for
quick
sharing.
thing about chapter 2 and chapter 3? Before our session, we had some informal chat about reforming the WEO and the GFSR. And I just suggest to the IMF really to reform them by dropping the analytical chapters from the WEO. There's no reason why those chapters have to be published right now during the annual meetings and spring meetings to compete for the attention of very busy delegates. They can be issued throughout the year as part of their studies and so on, and focus the WEO on chapter 1, looking at current risk, prospect, policy recommendation with deeper and fuller analysis. And that will command more attention and will be more valuable for members and delegates.
And
So
we are
that's
happy to host those events here at the Atlantic Council. When anyone at the IMF would like to launch any analytical chapters, as well as our colleagues at the World Bank. So, Elizabeth, I actually wanted to ask you about format, because we were talking about that. And also, we have a tradition here, and you're the newest senior fellow. We asked you to take us inside the room a little bit, and you've just been in this in the last cycle of the WEO. What it's like for people who don't really know when you go through the board meetings, the WEO process. I think it's always really interesting, you know, for people who care about this to understand how this goes from the draft that's put together to the actual publication and the feedback process.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not as orderly as one might hope. I mean, typically, we and the ED's offices are reaching out obsessively. When will we get this chapter? When will we get this chapter? And they filter in, and I think this is a great point that, you know, we in the board can't absorb all of this information, much less the public absorb all of it. So these really interesting, relevant findings are often overlooked in our board statements because we simply can't read all of it and get reactions from our authorities in order to draft a board statement and comment on it in the board. In the actual board meeting, which again can run 3 hours, you're limited to 3 minutes. Not everyone follows that 3 minutes, but really there's been a big effort since I was there to follow it more and more. And so I often didn't, if I did go over it, was maybe 4 minutes max. You can't cover everything in here in 4 minutes. So that speaks to a point that I made for all of my WEO board attendance, which is that I think the IMF needs to modernize how it does the WEO. It is such a valuable economic outlook, but because of the density, I think it's some 300 pages across all the documents and all the chapters and the annexes, it's impossible to really absorb all of it. Oftentimes, I find reading the blogs and the speeches of the 3 counselors makes a lot more sense, but then you're missing a gold mine of information and you're not seeing box 1.1 on page 33. So I think it's time, you know, there are a lot of reforms underway in the US and others, and this is a great reform that you could speak to efficiency but also effectiveness, where you crystallize your key messages, you set aside some of the more generic policy recommendations that are so high level that they're not really benefiting any one country, and then you release some of this additional excellent analysis on its own throughout the year, and it could really, I think, enhance the whole process significantly. So that's my pitch.
It's a good pitch. Nicole, you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, to that point and suggestion, and again, I don't know when the timing may have actually switched, or if it ever was different. But I will say, I mean, chapters 2 and 3 were released earlier.
Yes.
They are released at least, you know, as it stands, about a week, if not maybe 2 weeks, before chapter 1. And I think maybe that is done in part to, you know, alleviate, as you said, give them a little bit of time and space to breathe. They're perhaps not as heavily anticipated, maybe not as heavily potentially controversial. And, you know, and in fact, you know, actually we hosted one of the chapter launches on fragmentation, right? So maybe it needs to be a longer advance time. Maybe it does need to be fully separated, but I think that is probably, you know, there is some thought, or at least recognition, you know, of that. And I do find it helpful that they are released at least a little bit earlier.
But do you see any headlines on the silver economy or any of these chapters?
You mean coming out?
Right. Yeah. That's my point. Is I think even though they're released a little earlier, they're bundled with the WEO.
Right.
And so that's where I think you're losing some of the potential for the MD to go do a speech about one particular chapter. So
And she does. I mean, she did
Yeah.
reference it in
She does,
the curtain
yeah.
raiser. And like I
More
said,
these
so she-
speeches
The
be
70s
good.
and new
Martin.
50s certainly caught my attention.
Oh, you did. I saw you perked up at that. You like that data?
You feel you are
Yeah.
50 now.
Well, that makes me, roughly 45 or something. I don't know.
So we have 10 minutes left. I want to get to a couple audience questions, but I just wanted to talk for a moment about Mexico, which we've glossed over. I mean, the country is projected to be in recession now from the WEO, and this hasn't got a lot of attention, but this is obviously a direct result of what's happened, specifically the tariffs, even with not being part of reciprocal tariffs going on here. And it seems hard for me to believe, and Martin, this goes to the question about rosy projections that we talked about before, the feedback loop here, given the relationship with Mexico and the US and how this gets factored into the US. If you're at Mexico in recession, Canada downgraded significantly, how is this really getting priced in? And really my question is this, is the US going to grow below 1.8% when we get to the July WEO?
As I said, let's not focus much on the numbers because there's a lot we don't know. I mean, there could be agreements on how to go forward that would lift sentiments, that would actually lessen the impact. There is an upside possibility, if not risk, in the WEO that describes exactly that. What if the negotiations come to a relatively fast, I wouldn't say conclusion, but level of certainty what's going to happen? I mean, along the lines of what Secretary Besson said, if we can get to some kind of understanding on the broad parameters with, say, for example, China, then we can take more time for negotiations. So if we're in such a situation, the outlook could be very different. But yes, I mean, it's clear, and it's also from the relative changes between these different scenarios that in the short term, the US especially is shooting itself in the foot with these tariffs, but Mexico and Canada are the countries that are most closely integrated and will suffer with it. In a way, that's what the White House had said it kind of looked for, because the message was, well, if we really want to get some long-term increase in manufacturing, well, we need to have some short-term pain. So we shouldn't be surprised if the US government believes that they're on the right track with that part. Whether the long-term plays out with the manufacturing, I have my doubts, but it is in fact the scenario that was to some extent predicted.
Okay, so my final question for the group, and then raise your hands in the audience if you have questions. We had an important speech by Secretary Besson today about the future of the IMF and the World Bank and how the administration sees it. A lot of things we can unpack. We have 8 minutes. It's not an event on Secretary Besson's speech. We're certainly going to do events about the future of the Bretton Woods institutions. But I'll share with you my reaction and then curious for your response. There are a lot of people at the IMF who told me over the past several weeks, well, I think the bank is going to be targeted more by the administration than the fund. I did not have that takeaway from the administration. I thought they were equally, if not even a little more IMF focused, but certainly at least equally focused on both the fund and the bank. But I wanted to get this group's reaction to that, with certainly more conversations to come on this issue. I'll start with you.
I can start. Having been someone who helped contribute to these sorts of speeches for a number of years, I thought it was very well done. It hit the mark in terms of reassuring we are not stepping away. We, the US, are not stepping away from the fund and the bank, but we expect them to take serious reforms. And I thought the reforms that they put out there were not actually that new. They were things we've been asking the IMF to do for years, including some things that the Biden administration asked them to do.
Undersecretary Shambaugh's speech in many ways.
That's exactly right. And so will the fund be able to do them? Will they be able to deliver? That's a separate question. I think more to come on that. Maybe they'll take some of these requests more seriously. But the actual speech, I thought, did a great job of reassuring, especially when you think just even a few weeks ago, Secretary Besson was alluding to this, we're remaking the whole Bretton Woods. It's clear that remaking the Bretton Woods doesn't mean slashing and burning the original mandates of these institutions. So that's very good. So I thought it was a great reassurance for everyone.
No burning down of Bretton Woods from the speech today.
From the speech, no, at least not from that speech.
Right. Martin?
I think the no burning down. If I were the fire brigade, I would still keep my water ready, just in case. Because, look, I mean, we know that there are different voices within the administration. We've seen it now in the recent tariff episode. And There is a review ongoing about US membership in international institutions more broadly. And the way I see it, this is the opening of a negotiation process, both inside the administration and with countries that are part of these institutions. On the surface, I agree with Elizabeth. It was a good speech, and it triggered all the right points because it provided support while also mentioning some of the, I would say, long-standing concerns and complaints that the US and others, including myself, have had on the institution. But we shouldn't be kind of fooled by the fact that it will require some very concrete commitments, whether already by the time the review is over in, I believe, August, or not soon thereafter, that really something's going to change. Because we've heard these things many times, and the last, I would say, 5-6 years, definitely the fund has been going in a totally different direction. And even if now the tone for management is like 180 degrees reversed, it's not clear that A, they really have the credibility to change things in the way that the US wants. B, whether the countries, the membership that have supported that change away from the core mandate will just as easily give it up, because there's also political considerations there, especially, for example, in Europe when it comes to supporting African countries and climate targets. And then there is the question of, well, if we're talking about the core mandate and addressing the issues with the surplus countries that Secretary Besson was clear, then he's talking mainly about China, in my view. And there's been an attempt before to use the fund, or not use the fund, but to make the fund being more outspoken on Chinese policies, and that was back in 2007, the famous decision that led to the Chinese government basically withdrawing from the IMF process of Article 4 consultations. This time it could get even worse. And if the US is really serious, and I believe the fund should improve its surveillance over Chinese policies. But if they're serious, it may well lead to a split in the membership, and because we don't know the reaction of China. Now, this may be unavoidable if the fund is supposed to be useful. And I mean, as you know from some of the papers we've done here at the Atlantic Council, I personally believe that it would be important that the IMF and the World Bank stay firmly committed to the objectives of the democratic West, if you want. And if it's too difficult to bring China into the tent and have a sensible discussion with them in terms of trade and other economic policies, well, then we shouldn't push out maybe that discussion for too long, otherwise the institutions get damaged. So there is a lot of difficult issues that will have to be addressed in a very short time. And so, yes, it is supportive of the institutions, but they will need to demonstrate to the White House that they will be able to address some of the issues.
So Hung and Nicole, quick reactions from you, and then Christoph, I'm going to come to you for a question.
Basically, I think that why Secretary Besson officially stated that point, the demand from the US for the two institutions to focus on their core mandate is nothing new, should have been expected, and the fund should really organize the membership to do something about it. And from my point of view, both the WEO and the fund and the management of the fund and delegates missed this opportunity to really brainstorming discussion to see how the IMF can really promote, sustain, and balance trade going forward. Core mandate, when the fund got the core mandate, the world was different. 80 years ago, it was closed capital account, fixed but adjustable exchange rate. The fund could do something to promote balanced trade. Today, everyone wants free trade, free capital flow, free exchange market rates, and monetary sovereignty, all of which cannot coexist at the same time without tension. Now, given the new challenging and different world environment, what can the fund do to promote, sustain, balanced trade? It is a big analytical challenge and a big practical challenge, and I think the fund in the spring meeting missed the opportunity to do something about it.
But Nicole, I think this point well taken, Hung, but Nicole, it's not as if the Bank and the Fund aren't listening to the US. Our colleague Jeremy Mark who's a senior fellow with us here, pointed out that in the WEO, the word climate doesn't appear once. Very different WEO than 6 months ago. So they are paying close attention to what's happening, even if the bigger policy changes are difficult.
Absolutely. No mention of climate. And, while on the one hand, the World Bank recently, released a sort of long-awaited new gender strategy. We're, even in the jobs conversations, we might hear women's economic empowerment, but it's different. But back to that being said, I think to Besson's speech, I will just say, agree. I think good assurances, and in some ways, I was almost surprised to see expanded leadership. Not just status quo, but at least the potential for expanded leadership if there's getting back to basics. So I think there's some interesting things happening. And look, the bank has been going on its evolution agenda that had already started, and Ajay is making progress. There could be more, right? We'll see how some of these stickier, if you will, but critical things play out. But
I agree.
All things said, I think moment.
But we wait to see in August the 81st anniversary of the Bretton Woods Institution, or a week or so after, when the White House finishes its review. Christoph.
Yeah, I feel bad now because this has been the most interesting part, almost this last part. But I wanted to take it back to the decoding part of the WEO. So you rightly said this is all driven by these tariff decisions, and you see it on these charts up and down. But isn't what's really much more behind this and what should be incorporated here the uncertainty? Yeah. And this uncertainty is something that, in my mind now, is almost like a paradigm shift. We're not talking, you can of course say, okay, now they will cut some deals and everything will be fine. No, I think it's a fundamental thing that's happening now that people can't trust anymore that this is going to hold. And this extends beyond trade. It's, central bank independence and whatever else. So my question is, because I haven't read the WEO, but Elizabeth has, even down to
all 300 pages? Yeah.
No, this time not. I'm no longer on the hook for that. But in that box or wherever, how do they capture this risk moment, this risk element in their forecast, not only in the short term, but also in the longer term perspective? The WEO usually has a 5-year forecast too. So how should we think about this? I would like to kind of have somebody look under the hood and tell us about that.
So I'll let everyone respond and also use it as your final comment. But Martin, let's start with you.
I can take that, Christoph. As I said, there's an element of Knightian uncertainty, which means you can't really capture it, right? So you can describe it, but you have to admit that there's a lot you don't know, and which is, what are the next steps out of the White House. But there is one chart, and I wish I could tell you exactly where it is right now in the WEO, but in the chapter 1, it shows the confidence interval around the global growth numbers. And it's pretty eye-popping how much weight it is to the downside. So that's a reflection of the potential of what could go wrong in the next couple of years, actually. It's pretty bad for the medium term. But again, this could look very different in 3 months. So they are aware of the uncertainty. But what you mean, of course, the shift in the paradigm. I'm not sure whether it really is already gotten to a point where we say, well, the world will never be the same again. It really depends on how fast the White House kind of says, okay, we achieved our objective and we go back to a state of normal, maybe with somewhat higher tariffs, but not, again, with this kind of major uncertainty. So once the uncertainty is reduced, maybe we're in a different environment, it's a bit worse than before, but we can continue to live on. Maybe not. But it's very hard to kind of put that in a forecast. Yeah. You cannot just kind of reduce a potential world growth by 0.5% of GDP or something like that. It's very difficult. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But it's a good point.
Yeah. Nicole, and then Hung and Elizabeth, you have the final word.
Just picking up, uncertainty, of course, again, huge factor in the developing, emerging market developing economies. The uncertainty affects, of course, companies and their kind of international, not only their sort of domestic, but their international, their foreign direct investment, which of course has impacts on the EMDEs. I mean, the one thing I would say, maybe a little counter to my friend Martin here is, I think the one thing at least in the developing economies and in the sort of development finances, there's a pretty clear, I think, I don't want to dare say consensus, but emerging consensus that this is a new era. Tariffs may settle out, investments may go back up.
ODA.
Declining ODA is not likely to. Yeah. They're not opening USAID up back anytime soon, and the other countries that have also followed suit with 25% cuts. Those spigots are not likely to be turned back on. So I think there is a new world to some degree that we need to contend with.
Hung?
2 quick points to Chris. Uncertainty. I find one line in WEO chapter 1, which I think is absolutely right, and about all they can say about uncertainty. They wrote that the longer uncertainty lasts, the more damages it will do to the global economy. Full stop. I think you cannot say more than that. Number 2, I agree with Nicole. The WEO and the fund also failed to really signal the paradigm change that we see in front of our eyes. The 80 years old trading system based on rule, based on open trade, based on WTO is over. We are now entering into uncharted waters. Unilateral tariffs, bilateral retaliation, bilateral negotiation, where the strong will benefit, the weak will suffer. In that world, how do you analyze and how do you estimate growth? And I think that is another thing missing in the wheel that I find.
Elizabeth.
2 very quick points, because everyone else has covered it extensively. I think it's hard to quantify that paralysis that comes with uncertainty. And uncertainty, I wrote in my post, it's over 100 times the word is used in the GFSR.
No climate, but a lot of uncertainty.
Certainly uncertainty was covered. And I'm not of the caliber of economists that work at the IMF, but how you quantify decisions being put on hold, all of the things that come along with uncertainty that have real economic impacts, that's very difficult. I hope the fund does more work on that. But the second thing I think is, even if we have some resolution and the uncertainty, abodes, we still have a loss of trust, as you're noting, potentially in the U.S., and that comes up with its own impacts, economic impacts, that are also very hard to model because they're unprecedented. So that, I think, is going to be another piece to look for coming forward.
So we always end these events the same way, but I think this is a particularly interesting one. I ask everyone here, when we meet in October, will the IMF have upgraded or downgraded the overall forecast? So I'll go down the line. I'll start, Elizabeth, you're new, so I'll end with you and give you time to think about it. Nicole, first off to you.
Are we going global? Is this on the
Or just global, not a US.
I'm going to go down.
Hung?
Well, some up, some down, globally down.
Martin?
I'm the optimist.
Elizabeth?
I'm generally an optimist, but I have to say probably down. Yeah. 3
downs, 1 up. You'll all be held to account, although I don't remember what everyone said 6 months ago. So.
Josh?
Down. Yeah. On that note, I want to thank everyone for joining us. This has been an incredible day of programming, IMF World Bank Week at the Atlantic Council. Tomorrow we start at 9 a.m. We have a special series of events, including finance ministers from both Spain and Greece. We hope you join us. We want to congratulate our colleagues at the IMF and the World Bank for the programming they've put on so far and the hard work that goes in to the World Economic Outlook. This is an incredibly important document. The entire world reads this. So many decisions are based off it. It affects every economy in the world. That's why we spend the time decoding it. We appreciate you spending time with us here today. We wish everyone a pleasant rest of the day.